On the night Evelyn Carter received the invitation, she stood alone in the quiet kitchen of her Manhattan apartment, staring at the thick, cream-colored envelope as if it might explode in her hands. The return address said, "The Plaza Hotel, Fifth Avenue." Her husband's company crest was embossed in gold, elegant, cold, final. She didn't need to open it to know what it meant. For months, Richard Hale had been slowly erasing her, first from conversations, then from meetings, then from his public life. He stopped asking for her opinion, stopped telling people she was his wife, stopped looking at her when they were in the same room, and now, this invitation was his way of telling her that the final act was about to begin. The gala was not just a party, it was a declaration. Evelyn finally slid her finger under the seal and unfolded the card. The words blurred for a moment before her eyes focused. An evening of new beginnings. Her throat tightened. New beginnings rarely came without casualties. She placed the invitation on the marble counter beside her phone. 3 missed calls from Richard. No messages. He never left messages anymore. If she didn't answer, he assumed she didn't matter. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Manhattan skyline glowed like a lie. Glass towers, perfect lights, a city that rewarded power and punished silence. Evelyn rested a hand over her stomach, steadying herself as a familiar wave of nausea passed through her. Whether it was stress or something deeper, she didn't know yet. She only knew that her body seemed to sense the danger before her mind fully accepted it. She had once believed that marrying Richard Hale meant safety. Back then, she was the woman he couldn't stop talking about, the brilliant analyst who saw risks others ignored, the waitress from Ohio who fought her way into rooms that weren't built for people like her. He told her she grounded him, that she made him human. Now he treated her like a liability. Earlier that morning, her credit card had declined at a neighborhood pharmacy. A simple purchase, prenatal vitamins. The clerk had apologized, embarrassed for her. Evelyn had smiled, pretending it was a mistake. She didn't tell him that her billionaire husband had quietly restricted her access overnight. That was when she understood. This party wasn't meant for her. It was meant to replace her. Evelyn imagined the room already. Crystal chandeliers, jazz humming low, champagne flutes clinking like polite weapons. Richard standing tall in a tailored tuxedo, arm wrapped around someone younger, brighter, more obedient. A woman who didn't ask questions. A woman who knew when to smile and when to disappear. And Evelyn? She would be the ghost no one acknowledged. The wife people whispered about. The woman everyone assumed was already finished. Her phone buzzed again. A single text from Richard finally appeared. "Be there by 8. Don't make this difficult." Evelyn exhaled slowly, pressing her palms against the counter. He thought this night would break her. He had no idea it was about to expose him instead. Evelyn used to think silence in a marriage meant peace. That was what Richard taught her, slowly and carefully, like a lesson repeated until it felt like truth. In the early years, he called it discretion. Later, he called it support. By the time she understood what it really was, silence had already wrapped itself around her throat. It hadn't started cruelly. Richard never raised his voice. He never slammed doors or threw things. He didn't need to. His power lived in pauses, in glances, in the way he could end a conversation without saying a word. At dinners with investors, he would place a hand on her knee under the table whenever she spoke too long. A gentle squeeze, a reminder. Later, in the car, he would smile and say, "You did great. Just, next time, let me handle the room." At first, Evelyn believed him. She wanted to help. She wanted to belong. She told herself that powerful men needed calm wives, not complicated ones. So she stopped correcting him when he took credit for insights that had started as her late-night analyses. She stopped mentioning her former career. She let people assume she had stepped back because love mattered more than ambition. Richard never corrected them. Over time, the rules became clearer. Don't ask questions in public. Don't disagree in front of others. Don't bring up contracts, money, or strategy unless he invited it. And most importantly, don't embarrass him. Whenever she tried, even gently, he would tilt his head and say, "You're being emotional." Or worse, "You're overthinking again." Evelyn learned to swallow the words before they reached her tongue. At home, the penthouse was immaculate and cold, floor-to-ceiling windows, neutral furniture, everything curated to impress people who didn't live there. Richard spent most nights on his phone or laptop, his Mont Blanc pen tapping against the desk as he reviewed deals. Evelyn would sit nearby, pretending to read, waiting for him to look up. Sometimes he didn't notice her for hours. When she did speak, he listened with half his attention, nodding while scrolling. If she paused, he didn't ask her to continue. Silence filled the space, heavy and instructive. Eventually, she stopped trying. The day she quit her consulting work, he kissed her forehead and said, "Now you can finally relax." But relaxation felt a lot like disappearance. She became the woman who managed schedules, remembered birthdays, hosted dinners, and smiled through conversations where her name was slowly forgotten. Invitations came addressed to Richard Hale, +1. Never Evelyn Carter Hale. Just guest. And still, she told herself it was temporary, that once things settled, once the next deal closed, once the pressure eased, he would see her again. She didn't realize that silence wasn't a phase. It was training. By the time Richard began acting as if she didn't exist, he was only finishing what he had started years earlier. He had shaped a wife who knew how to stay quiet, how to disappear gracefully, how to doubt herself before questioning him. And that was exactly why he believed she would never fight back. The first time Evelyn realized something was wrong, it happened in the most ordinary way. She was standing at a small pharmacy 2 blocks from their building, holding a basket with prenatal vitamins, ginger chews, and a simple bottle of water. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that belonged to the world of galas and champagne. Just quiet, practical things meant to make it through another day. When the cashier rang her up, the screen beeped once, then again. "I'm sorry," the woman said gently, lowering her voice as if money problems were contagious. "It looks like the card was declined." Evelyn blinked. That can't be right. She reached into her purse and handed over the same sleek black card Richard insisted she carry. The one he said was easier than having separate accounts. The cashier tried again. Declined. A couple behind her shifted impatiently. Heat crept up Evelyn's neck. She forced a smile, paid with the emergency cash she kept folded in her wallet, and walked out into the cold afternoon air with shaking hands. At first, she told herself it was a technical glitch. Inside the lobby of their building, marble floors gleaming under soft lights, she pulled out her iPhone and opened her banking app. The loading wheel spun longer than usual. When the screen finally refreshed, her stomach dropped. Her access had been restricted. No warning, no conversation, just a quiet lock placed on her life. She stared at the numbers, trying to make sense of them. The joint account she managed for years now showed a message in small gray text. "Limited user permissions." She scrolled, hoping to find a mistake. There wasn't one. Evelyn pressed the call button next to Richard's name. It rang 3 times before going to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. She already knew how that would end. In the elevator ride up to the penthouse, she leaned against the mirrored wall, watching her reflection. She looked composed, calm. No one would guess that moments ago she had been reduced to a woman apologizing at a counter for a card she didn't control. Once inside, the apartment felt larger than usual, quieter. She set the pharmacy bag on the counter and sat down, opening her laptop out of instinct. Old habits, numbers made sense, systems could be understood. This wasn't random. Richard never acted without intention. She searched her email, her calendar, her memory. The timing was precise. The luxury party was 3 days away. Investors would be present. Media, too. Limiting her access now wasn't about money. It was about leverage. A way to remind her who held power. A way to make her hesitate before stepping into a room she was no longer meant to belong to. If she couldn't even buy basic necessities without embarrassment, how could she stand confidently among Manhattan's elite? Her phone buzzed. A text from Richard finally appeared. "Everything okay? Saw a notification? Probably nothing." Probably nothing. Evelyn closed her eyes, breathing slowly. This was the first cut, not loud, not dramatic, but precise enough to draw blood and deep enough to warn her. The party wasn't just about replacing her. It was about breaking her before she arrived. Evelyn first saw Madison Row 2 weeks before the gala, and the moment stayed with her like a splinter under the skin. It was a charity mixer hosted at a glass-walled venue overlooking the Hudson, one of those events where money whispered instead of shouted. Evelyn had arrived alone, as she often did now. Richard was running late, which usually meant he would appear just long enough to be seen. She was halfway through a polite conversation with a board member when the energy in the room shifted. Laughter rippled from the entrance. Heads turned. Phones slipped discreetly into hands. That was when Madison walked in. She was young, effortlessly polished, and dressed with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Her dark hair fell perfectly over one shoulder, her heels clicked with purpose against the marble floor, and her smile suggested familiarity, not curiosity. She didn't scan the room like a newcomer. She moved through it like a hostess. Evelyn noticed the details immediately, the way people leaned in, the way introductions happened without effort, the way Madison accepted compliments as if they were overdue. Then Richard appeared beside her. He placed a hand at the small of Madison's back, guiding her forward. Not protectively, possessively. The gesture was subtle, but Evelyn felt it like a bruise forming. "Everyone," Richard said smoothly, his voice carrying just far enough. "This is Madison. She's been helping us refine the company's public image." "Us." Evelyn waited. She stood only a few feet away, expecting him to add something else. A glance, a word, an acknowledgement. It didn't come. Madison's eyes flicked toward Evelyn for a fraction of a second. Not confused, not threatened. Curious, like someone spotting a misplaced object. Then she turned back to the group, laughing at something Richard whispered in her ear. No introduction followed. One of the board members leaned toward Evelyn and murmured, "Is that—" Evelyn forced a polite smile. "I'm Richard's wife." The man blinked, clearly surprised. "Oh, of course. I didn't realize—" His sentence faded, swallowed by the sound of Madison's laughter again. As the evening unfolded, Evelyn watched the pattern repeat. Madison spoke where Evelyn once had. Madison stood at Richard's side, hand brushing his arm, while Evelyn hovered at the edges of conversations that used to center around her insights. When someone mentioned strategy, Madison nodded knowingly. When donors praised the direction things were going, Madison accepted the credit. It was as if Evelyn had already been written out of the story. At one point, Richard passed Evelyn without stopping. His shoulder brushed hers, barely. He didn't look at her, didn't slow down. Later, in the car ride home, he said nothing about Madison. Not her name, not her role, not the way he had looked at her. Evelyn stared out the window at the blurred city lights, her chest tight. That night, lying awake beside him, she finally understood something she had been avoiding. Madison wasn't a rumor. She was an announcement. And the luxury party wasn't going to introduce a new woman. It was going to confirm that the old one no longer mattered. Evelyn found the document by accident. which was the only reason she ever saw it clearly. It was buried in a folder labeled Estate Planning, Final, tucked inside Richard's private drawer. She hadn't gone looking for it. She was searching for a medical insurance form after another quiet warning email from the provider. Instead, her fingers brushed against thick paper, heavier than the rest. The title stopped her breath. Postnuptial Agreement, Amendment B. She sat down slowly at the dining table, the city glowing beyond the glass like it was watching. Her hands were steady as she flipped the pages. Too steady. Years of training had taught her how to read legal language without reacting. She remembered the night she signed it. Richard had brought it home late, long after dinner. He was tired, stressed, affectionate in the distracted way he used when he wanted compliance. He told her it was just an update, something his lawyers recommended to simplify tax exposure and protect future children. He said it didn't change anything between them. Everyone does this, he had said, handing her a Mont Blanc pen. It's boring, but necessary. She trusted him. Now, reading it line by line, Evelyn realized how carefully that trust had been weaponized. The amendment reclassified several shared assets as pre-managed holdings. It limited her claim in the event of marital instability. It included language that allowed temporary financial restriction if she posed a reputational risk. The words were polite, clinical, devastating. She turned to the signature page. Her name stared back at her. The date was 6 months ago, the same week Richard had insisted she stop consulting and focus on her health. The same week Madison first appeared on internal emails as a brand advisor. The same week Richard began sleeping with his phone face down. Evelyn felt cold spread through her chest. This wasn't preparation. It was strategy. The document explained everything. The declined card, the restricted access, the confidence with which Richard moved through rooms as if she no longer existed. Legally, he had already begun separating her from the life they built. Quietly, patiently. Her phone buzzed. A message from Richard. Did you find the insurance form? She stared at the screen, then typed back with deliberate calm. Yes, I'll handle it. She didn't confront him. Not yet. She knew better now. This wasn't a marriage problem. It was a chessboard, and she had just discovered she was missing pieces she didn't know existed. That night, she lay awake, replaying every moment he had rushed her, distracted her, softened his voice before asking for a signature. Every time he told her she didn't need her own lawyer because we're on the same side. The truth settled in with terrifying clarity. Richard hadn't just stopped loving her. He had planned for her silence. And the party at the plaza wasn't a celebration of success. It was the moment he intended to make her disappearance official. But for the first time since this began, Evelyn didn't cry. She folded the document carefully, slid it back into the folder, and placed everything exactly as she found it. If Richard believed paperwork could erase her, he was about to learn something far more dangerous. She knew how to read contracts, and she had just read his endgame. By the end of that week, Evelyn understood something that hurt more than the contract itself. Richard didn't need to convince her she was powerless. He had already convinced everyone else. It happened in small, almost invisible ways. An unanswered email from a woman who once called her weekly. A lunch invitation quietly withdrawn. A foundation board meeting rescheduled without including her. Each moment alone meant nothing. Together they formed a pattern that pressed against her chest until breathing felt deliberate. At a brunch on the Upper East Side, one of Richard's longtime partners greeted her with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. He asked about her health instead of her work. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if she might break. You must be under so much stress, he said, patting her arm. Richard's been carrying a lot lately. Carrying a lot. Evelyn nodded the way she had learned to. Around them, sunlight bounced off crystal glasses, and conversations hummed with deals and vacations and futures she was no longer assumed to be part of. No one asked her opinion. No one asked her plans. She realized with a quiet horror that a version of her had already been introduced to these people. A fragile one, an unstable one, a wife who needed managing. That version wasn't her, but it was the one Richard had been carefully feeding them. Later that afternoon, she received an email from the family attorney. Polite, neutral, devastating. It reminded her of the confidentiality clauses she had agreed to and gently suggested that emotional decisions could complicate matters for everyone involved. Everyone involved. Evelyn read it twice, then closed her laptop and stared at the wall. Her reflection in the darkened screen looked smaller than she remembered. Not weak, just erased. She tried calling an old friend from her consulting days, someone who once trusted her instincts enough to stake millions on them. The call went to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. She already knew the silence would be returned. That night, Richard came home late. He smelled faintly of expensive cologne that wasn't hers. He loosened his tie, poured himself a drink, and spoke casually, as if nothing were wrong. "I heard you were asking questions," he said lightly. Evelyn's heart thudded. "I was clarifying." He smiled, calm and confident. "You don't need to worry about those things anymore." There it was, not anger, not confrontation, just certainty. He believed the room belonged to him, the lawyers, the board, the story. He believed that by the time the luxury party arrived, Evelyn would already understand her place. And the most terrifying part was that, for a moment, she almost believed him too. She lay awake long after he fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, listening to the city breathe around them. She thought about how easily truth could be bent when power repeated a lie often enough. How quickly a woman could become a problem simply by existing in the wrong place. Evelyn didn't cry. She did something far more dangerous. She stopped trying to explain herself. If everyone already believed Richard, then words would never save her. Only timing would. And for the first time, she began to think not about defending herself, but about letting him walk straight into the moment he was most certain he had already won. Evelyn didn't find the evidence because she was looking for it. She found it because Richard made a mistake. It happened late at night, the apartment quiet except for the low hum of the city below. Richard was already asleep, his phone charging on the nightstand like it always did, face down, password protected, untouchable. Evelyn sat at the dining table with her laptop open, trying to distract herself with old work habits, numbers, logic, anything that reminded her she still existed outside the story Richard had written for her. A soft chime broke the silence. An email notification appeared on her screen. At first, she almost ignored it. Then she saw the subject line. Timeline confirmation, final. It wasn't addressed to her. It was forwarded to her by mistake. Her name wasn't in the recipient list. Richard's was. Along with two others she recognized immediately, the firm's outside counsel and someone from public relations. Madison Rowe. Evelyn's pulse quickened as she opened it. The message was short, clinical, and devastating. It outlined a sequence of events scheduled around the gala, talking points, press positioning, the formal transition narrative. It referenced her as the spouse and recommended limiting her exposure due to emotional volatility. There was even a suggested line in case reporters asked why she wasn't present at future events. She has chosen to focus on her personal well-being. Evelyn felt the room tilt. Attached to the email were documents. She opened the first one, her breath shallow. It was a payment schedule tied to a shell consultancy, Madison's company. The amounts were large, structured in neat intervals, routed through a subsidiary Evelyn recognized immediately, one she had once helped assess for risk. Conflict of interest. She opened another attachment, internal notes from legal, language about controlled disclosure, a reference to pre-existing signatures that would hold under scrutiny. Her hands trembled as she scrolled. There it was, a clause from the post-nuptial amendment, the one allowing financial restriction if she posed reputational risk. The same language now echoed in the PR strategy memo, legal and narrative moving in lockstep. This wasn't chaos. It was coordination. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her chest tight. She had spent years building safeguards for other people's money, other people's reputations. She recognized the pattern instantly now that she was looking at it from the outside. Richard wasn't reacting. He was executing. And Madison wasn't just a mistress. She was part of the mechanism. The realization settled slowly, like ice forming in her veins. If this email existed, others did too. If timelines were confirmed, meetings had already happened, decisions already made. The party was just the stage. Evelyn closed the laptop carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile clarity she had just gained. For the first time in weeks, fear gave way to something sharper. Focus. She didn't forward the email, she didn't print it, she didn't confront Richard or wake him. She understood now that exposure without strategy would only accelerate her erasure. Instead, she memorized details, names, dates, the rhythm of the plan. Richard stirred slightly in his sleep, unaware that his greatest advantage had just disappeared. Evelyn stood by the window watching the city lights blink against the dark. They thought she was unstable. They thought she was quiet because she was weak. But silence, she realized, had given her something they never expected: time. Fear didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as reason. The morning after Evelyn discovered the email, her phone buzzed before sunrise. A notification from the bank, then another, and another. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, as alerts stacked across the screen like accusations. Account access changed, spending limit adjusted. Secondary authorization required. Richard hadn't confronted her. He hadn't accused her of snooping or demanded explanations. Instead, he tightened the net. By the time she walked into the kitchen, her phone rang. It was the family attorney. His voice was calm, professional, and unmistakably prepared. He spoke about temporary measures, about protecting all parties, about reducing stress during a sensitive transition. He reminded her, gently, of the clauses she had signed, the ones that allowed financial controls if her actions risked reputational harm. Given the circumstances, he said, we advise you to keep a low profile. Low profile. Evelyn thanked him and ended the call, her hands shaking as she set the phone down. The apartment felt different now, smaller, as if the walls were closing in, listening. She tried to ground herself in logic. She opened her laptop, pulling up old spreadsheets, trying to anchor her thoughts. But her vision blurred, numbers swimming uselessly across the screen. This was the moment Richard had engineered. Not with shouting, not with threats, with isolation. By lunchtime, she realized she couldn't order food without approval. Her ride app wouldn't process payment. Even the grocery delivery she'd scheduled earlier that week had been canceled automatically. It wasn't about money. It was about fear. Evelyn sat on the couch, staring at the city through glass that suddenly felt like a barrier instead of a view. She imagined the future Richard wanted for her, quiet, removed, managed by lawyers and polite emails, a woman described, not consulted. Her chest tightened. What if he won? What if she pushed back and lost everything, access, credibility, the fragile protection she still had? What if the evidence wasn't enough? What if no one believed her, just like they already didn't? The questions spiraled, each one sharper than the last. For the first time since this began, Evelyn felt the weight of exhaustion pressed down on her shoulders. Not physical tiredness, but the kind that comes from being outnumbered by systems designed to crush dissent. She slid down onto the floor, her back against the sofa, knees drawn in. The silence roared. Her breathing turned shallow. Tears blurred her vision before she realized she was crying. This was what Richard expected. A woman alone in a beautiful cage, too afraid to move. For a long moment, Evelyn stayed there, letting the fear wash over her, letting it speak, letting it try to convince her that survival meant surrender. Then something shifted. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked up, really looked, at the space around her. The flawless furniture, the controlled elegance, the life built to impress everyone except the woman living inside it. Fear hadn't protected her. Silence hadn't protected her. Compliance hadn't protected her. Slowly, Evelyn stood. If fear was inevitable, she decided, then she would carry it with her, forward. Because the moment she stayed still was the moment Richard truly won, and she wasn't ready to disappear yet. The breakdown came in the only place Evelyn was still allowed to be invisible. The bathroom. It was nearly midnight when it happened. Richard wasn't home. He had texted earlier, something vague about a late meeting and not waiting up. Evelyn hadn't replied. She had learned that silence was safer than honesty when honesty could be used against her. She stood barefoot on the cool marble floor, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed unfamiliar. Her hair was pulled into a loose knot. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her shoulders were tense, drawn inward, as if bracing for impact. This wasn't how she saw herself. The nausea hit suddenly. She barely made it to the sink before retching, her hands gripping the edge as her body betrayed her composure. When it passed, she stayed there, breathing hard, forehead pressed against the glass. That was when the tears came. Not dramatic, not loud. They slipped down quietly, blurring the sharp lines of the room. Evelyn sank onto the closed toilet lid, covering her mouth with her hand to keep from making a sound. Even alone, she felt the reflex to stay quiet, to be manageable. Her thoughts fractured. What if I'm wrong? What if this destroys me? What if I lose everything and everyone? She pressed her palm flat against her chest, trying to slow her breathing. The room felt too bright, too perfect. Every surface reflected control, order, a life curated to hide cracks, and she was cracking. Evelyn slid down until her back rested against the vanity, knees drawn close. She let herself cry then, fully, shoulders shaking, the sound swallowed by thick walls and running water. For the first time since this began, she allowed herself to feel how deeply betrayed she was. Not just by Richard. By the version of herself that had believed love required disappearance. Her gaze fell to the counter, where a small black Kindle rested beside her phone. She had downloaded it weeks ago, late one night when sleep wouldn't come. A quiet rebellion. Inside, it was a single book she kept returning to without knowing why. Meditations. She wiped her face, picked it up, and opened to a page she had bookmarked earlier. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. The words settled slowly, not as comfort, but as challenge. Evelyn laughed weakly through tears. Strength felt like a foreign language, but something about seeing the sentence again, here, on the floor of a bathroom she no longer felt belonged to her, anchored her. She wasn't powerless. She was trapped, and traps, she knew, were designed. Which meant they could be studied. She sat there for a long time, the city humming faintly beyond the glass, letting the emotion burn itself out. When the tears finally slowed, she stood, splashed cold water on her face, and looked at herself again. Her eyes were red, but they were clear. The breakdown hadn't destroyed her. It had stripped away the last illusion that endurance alone would save her. Evelyn turned off the lights and walked back into the dark apartment, carrying fear, grief, and something new beside them. Resolve. Because if this was the lowest point, then there was only one direction left to move, and next time she wouldn't break alone. The next morning, Evelyn didn't wake up angry. She woke up precise. The fear from the night before hadn't vanished, but it had settled into something colder, sharper. Fear could scatter you, she had learned, but clarity could aim you. She showered, dressed simply, and packed a small tote with things that mattered. Her laptop, a notebook, her passport, and the Kindle she hadn't put down since the night before. She left the penthouse before Richard returned, walking out as if she still belonged there. Because for now, she did. She took a car across town and asked to be dropped near a quiet office building she hadn't visited in years. The kind of place no paparazzi cared about. No glass walls, no grand lobby, just discretion. Jonathan Reed's name wasn't on the directory. It never was. Inside, the office smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Familiar. Grounded. Evelyn waited, hands folded, heart steady in a way that surprised her. When Jonathan finally walked in, his expression shifted from mild surprise to something deeper. Concern. He didn't hug her. He didn't ask how she was doing. He simply said, "You shouldn't be here unless it's serious." "It is," Evelyn replied. She told him everything. Not emotionally, not defensively. She laid it out the way she used to present risk models to boards that didn't want to hear bad news. The contract, the financial restrictions, the email, the timeline around the gala, Madison's role, Richard's confidence. Jonathan listened without interrupting, his pen still, his gaze steady. When she finished, the room was quiet. Finally, he leaned back. "You're not asking me to save you," he said. "No," Evelyn replied. "I'm asking you to tell me the truth about my options." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Then listen carefully." What followed wasn't a pep talk. It was a warning. Richard was powerful. His lawyers were aggressive. If Evelyn moved too early, too loudly, she would lose control of the narrative and possibly her access to everything that mattered. The evidence she had was real, but timing would determine whether it protected her or destroyed her. "This isn't about revenge," Jonathan said. "It's about leverage and witnesses." They talked for hours, about when silence helped and when it killed you, about letting someone believe they'd won so completely that they exposed themselves, about how public certainty could become a liability. By the time Evelyn stood to leave, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Grounded. Jonathan walked her to the door. "If you do this," he said quietly, "you have to commit. No hesitation, no second guessing." Evelyn met his eyes. "I'm done hesitating." Outside, the city moved around her, unaware that anything had shifted. She took a deep breath, pulled out her phone, and deleted half the messages she had saved but no longer needed. She wasn't planning to confront Richard. She was planning to let him perform. The luxury party would be his stage, his audience, his moment of certainty, and when the room was full, when the lights were brightest, when he believed there was nothing left to fear, that was when protection would look like power. The night of the luxury party arrived wrapped in perfect timing. Manhattan glittered as if it had been polished for the occasion. Traffic slowed near Fifth Avenue, headlights reflecting off storefront glass and polished stone. At the Plaza Hotel, valets opened doors with practiced ease, while cameras flashed softly, never intrusive, always selective. Evelyn Carter stepped out of the car alone. She wore a simple black dress. No dramatic cut, no statement jewelry, nothing that begged for attention. The kind of elegance that didn't try to compete with the room, the kind that waited. Inside, the ballroom breathed money. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across silk gowns and tailored suits. Jazz hummed low, controlled, expensive. Champagne flowed in narrow flutes held by people who spoke in careful tones about markets, acquisitions, and the future. Evelyn felt every step, not because she was afraid, but because she was awake. She could feel the weight of the room trying to define her before she spoke. She recognized the glances: curious, dismissive, sympathetic, dangerous. Somewhere in the crowd, a narrative was already forming about why she was here and how long she would last. She didn't look for Richard right away. Instead, she paused near the edge of the room, letting the rhythm of the night settle into her bones. This was the moment he believed belonged to him. The final confirmation of control, the reward for months of quiet manipulation. Across the ballroom, she saw him. Richard Hale stood beneath the chandeliers as if they had been installed for him alone. Perfect tuxedo, relaxed posture, the confidence of a man who had already decided the ending. At his side stood Madison Rowe, radiant in a pale gown that caught the light just enough to be noticed. They laughed together. Richard leaned in to speak to Madison, his hand resting familiarly at her back. Not hidden, not cautious. It was the posture of a man who believed he was untouchable. Evelyn watched without flinching. She noticed how people clustered around him: board members, investors. A journalist she recognized from a financial magazine. Each conversation flowed easily, uninterrupted. No one asked where his wife was, because they assumed they already knew. As Evelyn moved deeper into the room, conversations faltered for half a second. Not long enough to be rude, long enough to register. She heard her name once, whispered. She felt a familiar instinct rise, to shrink, to adjust, to apologize for existing. She didn't. She stopped near a marble column, her back straight, her expression calm. From here, she could see everything. Richard greeting donors, Madison receiving compliments as if she were already permanent. The subtle choreography of power unfolding exactly as planned. Richard finally noticed her. For a brief moment, his expression tightened. Just enough. Then he smiled. Not warmly, politely, like a man acknowledging a detail he believed no longer mattered. He turned back to his guests. That was the moment Evelyn understood something with absolute clarity. This room was full of witnesses, and Richard, certain of his victory, was about to give them everything they needed. Without realizing, the lights had already shifted. The party had begun. Richard didn't confront Evelyn. That was the cruelest part. Instead, he erased her. It happened gradually, almost elegantly, the way powerful men remove inconveniences without appearing unkind. As the night deepened, Richard positioned himself at the center of the ballroom, drawing investors and board members into a loose semicircle. Champagne was refreshed. Laughter rose. Attention followed him like gravity. Evelyn stood less than 20 feet away, invisible. When a senior partner clinked his glass and asked Richard about the next chapter, Richard smiled with practiced ease. He wrapped an arm around Madison's waist, pulling her slightly closer, a gesture intimate enough to be unmistakable. "We're entering a phase of renewal," he said, "personally and professionally." A few people laughed softly. Someone murmured approval. Evelyn felt the words land like cold water. Madison tilted her head, playing her role perfectly. She smiled but said nothing, allowing the implication to hang in the air. Her hand rested lightly on Richard's chest, as if it already belonged there. A woman beside Evelyn leaned toward her companion and whispered, not quietly enough, "Is that his—" Her friend shrugged. "I thought the wife wasn't well." "Not well." The phrase repeated itself in Evelyn's mind as Richard continued speaking. He thanked donors. He praised the company's resilience. He spoke about stability, leadership, and vision. words he had once rehearsed with Evelyn late at night at their dining table. Now he delivered them without looking at her once. A journalist stepped forward, microphone discreet, voice warm. "Mr. Hale, many people admire how gracefully you've navigated recent changes. Any comment on how this has affected your family?" Richard didn't hesitate. "My priority has always been protecting those involved," he said calmly. "Sometimes that means respecting personal boundaries." Personal boundaries. The crowd nodded, satisfied. It was a clean answer, a generous one. It framed him as thoughtful, restrained, reasonable. And it framed Evelyn as the problem without ever naming her. She felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the instinct to step forward, to correct the narrative before it hardened into fact. Her fingers curled slightly at her side. "Don't react." She remembered Jonathan's voice. "Let him perform." Madison leaned in and whispered something to Richard that made him laugh. The sound carried, easy, confident, the laugh of a man who believed he had already won. Someone raised a glass. "To new beginnings," they said. Richard lifted his champagne in response. "To clarity," he replied. The word echoed. Clarity. Evelyn watched as glasses clinked around him, watched as people smiled at Madison like she was already a fixture, watched as Richard stood in the exact spot where, years earlier, he had introduced Evelyn as the smartest person in the room. No one looked at her now. For a brief moment the room tilted. The noise faded. She felt the full weight of what he had done, not just to her marriage, but to her identity. He had rewritten her presence out of the story in real time, in front of witnesses who would carry this version forward. This was the humiliation he had planned. This was the breaking point he expected. Evelyn took a slow breath and straightened her shoulders. He thought silence meant defeat. He had no idea it meant restraint, because in erasing her so publicly, Richard had just done something irreversible. He had confirmed everything. And the room, whether it realized it yet or not, had just watched him cross the line that would cost him everything. The first shock didn't come from what Evelyn said. It came from what she didn't do. As Richard lowered his glass and the applause softened into satisfied murmurs, Evelyn made a decision so quiet that no one noticed it at first. She didn't step forward. She didn't interrupt. She didn't plead for recognition or rush to defend herself. She turned, and she walked away. Not quickly, not dramatically. Just a calm, deliberate pivot, heels steady against the polished floor as she moved toward the edge of the ballroom. The motion was subtle, but in a room trained to notice shifts in power, it rippled outward like a disturbance in still water. A few conversations faltered mid-sentence. Someone near the bar paused, eyes following her. Another guest glanced from Evelyn to Richard, then back again, uncertainty flickering across their face. The unspoken question hung in the air. Why isn't she reacting? Evelyn felt it all without looking back. The instinct to shrink tugged at her, the old reflex telling her to stay small, stay agreeable, stay invisible. She ignored it. Each step away from the center felt like reclaiming oxygen. Near the tall windows overlooking Fifth Avenue, she stopped. From here, she could see the room clearly, and the room could see her, not as an interruption, as a presence that refused to orbit Richard's gravity any longer. Richard noticed then. At first, his eyes narrowed slightly, confused. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to linger, to look wounded, to confirm the story he had just sold so neatly. Instead, she was leaving the stage. He leaned toward Madison, murmuring something with a smile that didn't quite hold. Madison followed his gaze, her expression tightening for just a moment before smoothing back into practiced composure. "Everything okay?" someone asked Richard quietly. "Of course," he replied. "Just a misunderstanding." But his attention kept drifting. Across the room, Evelyn stood alone, Her posture relaxed, her hands loosely clasped. She didn't scan for exits. She didn't look lost. If anything, she looked relieved. That was when the whispers started. "She's leaving already? Is that his wife? That's unexpected." A woman who had once praised Evelyn's work leaned toward her companion. "I thought she'd make a scene." So did Richard. That was the trap he had prepared for. The emotional outburst, the accusation, the proof that she was, as he'd suggested, unstable, difficult, unfit for the polished world he inhabited. But Evelyn didn't give him that. Instead, she stood quietly, eyes focused on the city beyond the glass, as if reminding herself that there was a world larger than this room, larger than him. The band shifted into a softer tune. Glasses clinked again, but the energy had changed. Something was off. The script had been interrupted. Richard excused himself from a conversation and took a step in her direction, then stopped. Approaching her now would draw attention, and attention, in moments like this, was dangerous. Evelyn finally turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes across the space. No anger, no tears, just clarity. It unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. Because in walking away first, Evelyn had done something he never anticipated. She had refused to play the role he had written for her. And that refusal, the quietest act of defiance, was the first crack in the image he had worked so hard to control. The room felt it, even if it didn't yet understand why. The second shock arrived without music, without announcement, and without urgency, which was exactly why it landed so hard. Evelyn was still standing near the windows when the energy in the ballroom shifted again. This time it wasn't laughter or applause that caused it. It was silence. A subtle thinning of sound, as if conversations had paused to make room for something unnamed. She felt it before she saw it. People near the entrance straightened. Phones were lowered. A few heads turned at once, then more, until attention rippled backward through the room like a wave reversing direction. A man had entered. He wasn't flashy. No entourage, no dramatic entrance. Just a tall figure in a dark suit, moving with the calm certainty of someone who didn't need to announce his relevance. He paused briefly at the threshold, scanning the room not for admiration, but for alignment. Jonathan Reed. Evelyn didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't acknowledge him at all. That was part of the plan. Across the ballroom, Richard noticed the shift immediately. His posture stiffened, instincts sharpening. He followed the line of sight and froze for half a second too long. He knew that man. So did the board members. Jonathan Reed wasn't listed on the program. He wasn't a donor. He wasn't press. He was something far more unsettling. Someone who evaluated power rather than admired it. A managing partner whose quiet opinions had redirected investments, dissolved alliances, and ended careers without ever raising his voice. Jonathan crossed the room slowly, exchanging nods with people who recognized him and pretended not to stare. He stopped briefly to shake hands with a senior investor, then another. Each interaction was brief, controlled, purposeful. Richard watched, his smile fixed, his mind racing. Why was Reed here? Jonathan hadn't come for him. He came to Evelyn. When Jonathan reached her, he didn't touch her. He didn't speak loudly. He simply stood beside her, facing the room as if that had always been his place. And then he said, calmly, clearly, "Evelyn." Her name carried farther than expected. Heads turned. A few people leaned in instinctively, drawn by the way he said it, not as a courtesy, but as a recognition. Evelyn turned to face him then. Just slightly. Enough. "Jonathan," she replied. That was all, but it was enough. Across the room, Richard's confidence fractured, not visibly, not completely, just a hairline crack running through the certainty he had worn all night. Someone near him whispered, "Do you know him?" Richard nodded once. Yes. The word tasted wrong in his mouth. Jonathan spoke again, his tone conversational, unhurried. "I was hoping to catch you before things wrapped up." Before things wrapped up. The phrase hung in the air like a countdown. Evelyn felt the weight of the room shift, not toward her, but away from Richard. Curiosity replaced comfort. Attention recalibrated. This wasn't a rescue, it was a reframe. Jonathan didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply stood there, a quiet counterbalance to Richard's performance, signaling to everyone present that something worth watching was about to happen. And for the first time that night, Richard understood something far more dangerous than embarrassment. He was no longer controlling the room. The audience had found a new point of focus, and Evelyn, still silent, still composed, was no longer alone at the edge of the story. She was standing exactly where power was about to change hands. Jonathan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a slim tablet, the movement so unremarkable that it took a second for the room to realize something had shifted. Conversations nearby slowed. People leaned subtly closer, not out of curiosity alone, but instinct. This was the posture of someone about to present facts, not feelings. "Richard," Jonathan said evenly, "before the evening goes any further, there's something the board should be aware of." The word board acted like a switch. Several men straightened. A woman near the center set her glass down without realizing it. Richard's smile tightened, his jaw flexing once before he smoothed his expression back into place. "I'm not sure this is the right time," Richard replied lightly. "We're celebrating tonight." Jonathan nodded. "That's exactly why it is." He tapped the screen once and turned it outward, not toward Richard, but toward two senior board members standing nearby. He didn't explain. He didn't summarize. He let them read. Silence spread. One of the men frowned, then scrolled. His expression shifted from mild confusion to focused concern. He handed the tablet to the woman beside him without a word. Evelyn watched the air change. This wasn't drama. It was recognition. Jonathan spoke again, calm as ever. "This outlines a timeline of transactions connected to Hale Holdings subsidiaries. Payments routed through a consultancy that appears to be independent, but isn't." Richard let out a short laugh. "That's a misinterpretation." Jonathan looked at him then. Just once. "It would be," he said, "if the consultancy weren't directly tied to an individual currently acting as your public representative." All eyes turned, slowly, toward Madison. Her smile froze. Jonathan continued, his tone precise. "The conflict of interest is documented, as is the coordination between legal language in a recent post-nuptial amendment and the PR narrative prepared ahead of tonight's event." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Post-nuptial?" Evelyn remained still, her hands steady at her sides. She didn't need to speak. The truth was moving faster without her. Richard stepped forward slightly. "This is inappropriate," he said, voice firmer now. "Any internal matters should be handled privately." "Agreed," Jonathan replied. "They should have been." He turned the tablet again, this time revealing highlighted text. Dates, signatures, cross-referenced clauses. One board member inhaled sharply. Another shook his head once, slowly. "This language," the woman said carefully, "mirrors our reputational risk policy." Jonathan nodded. "Exactly." Madison's eyes darted around the room, searching for reassurance. She found none. The attention she had enjoyed minutes earlier had turned clinical, evaluative. Richard felt it too. For the first time that night, his voice lost its ease. "Evelyn," he said sharply, turning toward her, "is this what you're doing?" She met his gaze calmly. "No," she said. "This is what you did." The simplicity of the sentence landed harder than any accusation. The room held its breath. Because now, the story was no longer about a troubled wife or a graceful transition. It was about evidence. And evidence, once revealed in front of witnesses who understood its weight, didn't disappear quietly. It reshaped everything. Madison was the first to move. The moment the board members stopped looking at Richard and started looking at her, something sharp flickered across her face. Not guilt. Calculation. She had built her career on reading rooms, on sensing when attention turned from flattering to fatal. This attention had teeth. She laughed lightly, too quickly, and stepped forward as if the moment required charm. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice bright, professional. "I'm an external consultant. My role is purely advisory." No one responded. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was evaluative. Jonathan didn't look at her right away. He let the pause stretch, letting the room do the work for him. When he finally spoke, his tone was polite, almost courteous. "Your role," he said, "includes messaging strategy, correct?" Madison nodded. "Yes, but—" "And reputation management." "Of course." Jonathan turned the tablet once more, revealing another document. "Then perhaps you can explain why payments routed through your firm align precisely with milestones outlined in this internal legal memo." Madison's smile wavered. "That doesn't mean anything," she said quickly. "Consultants are paid based on deliverables." "Deliverables," Jonathan repeated, scrolling. "Such as preparing language to frame a spouse as emotionally unstable prior to a public appearance?" A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Madison's cheeks flushed. She glanced at Richard, expecting intervention. He didn't move. For the first time, she realized something was wrong. "I didn't write those clauses," she said sharply. "That's legal language." Jonathan nodded. "No one is suggesting you did. We're suggesting you coordinated with those who did." The distinction landed. Madison took a step back, heels clicking against the marble. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Richard, say something." Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. Every word now carried risk. A woman near the front, one of the board members, folded her arms. "Ms. Rowe," she said calmly, "were you aware that these arrangements could constitute a conflict of interest?" Madison swallowed. "I was told everything was cleared." "Told by whom?" Madison hesitated. The room noticed. Jonathan spoke softly. "This is the part where people usually realize they've been holding the wrong rope." Madison's composure cracked. She looked around, searching for support that no longer existed. Phones were out now, not recording, but messaging. Calculations were being made in real time. "This is becoming hostile," Madison said, forcing steel into her voice. "I don't have to stay here." She turned, intent on leaving. And that was the moment everything snapped into focus, because people didn't move to stop her. They stepped aside, not out of respect, out of distance. Madison took 3 steps before a quiet voice stopped her. "Ms. Rowe," Jonathan said evenly, "I wouldn't recommend leaving before counsel arrives." She froze. Slowly, she turned back, her face pale beneath the lights. For the first time that night, she looked young. Not powerful, not protected. Richard watched her, jaw clenched, realizing too late that the woman he had paraded as an asset was now a liability. And Evelyn, standing silently a few feet away, understood something with chilling clarity. Madison hadn't been special. She had been expendable, just like the wife Richard thought he had already erased. Richard waited until the room fractured into smaller clusters before he moved. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He did what men like him always did when power slipped. He tried to take the conversation somewhere private. He crossed the ballroom with purpose, his expression tight but composed, and reached Evelyn just as Jonathan was being pulled into a quiet exchange with 2 board members. Richard leaned in close, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You think you've won something tonight?" he said through a polite smile meant for anyone watching. "You haven't." Evelyn turned to face him fully for the first time all evening. Up close, she could see the strain beneath his control, the slight tremor in his jaw, the way his eyes kept flicking past her, checking who was watching. "I didn't come here to win," she said calmly. "I came here to stop losing." His smile faltered for half a second. "You're embarrassing yourself," he whispered. "This ends badly for you if you keep pushing." There it was. Not concern, not regret. Threat. Evelyn felt the familiar instinct rise, to explain, to soften, to make him comfortable. She let it pass. "You already decided how this would end," she replied. "You just didn't expect witnesses." Richard's gaze hardened. "You have no idea what you've triggered. The board will protect me. They always do." Behind him, laughter rang out too loudly. A donor excused herself abruptly. Another guest glanced over, sensing tension. Evelyn stepped slightly to the side, angling her body so others could see them. Not dramatically, just enough. "I know exactly what I've triggered," she said, "and so do they." Richard followed her line of sight. One of the board members was speaking quietly into his phone. Another was already halfway across the room, deep in conversation with legal counsel. No one was looking at Richard anymore. They were looking past him. For the first time, real fear surfaced in his eyes. "You should have come to me," he said, his voice dropping. "We could have handled this." Evelyn met his gaze, steady. "You didn't want to handle it. You wanted to erase it." Richard straightened, anger flashing through his restraint. "You were never built for this world," he snapped. "You don't survive here by playing victim." Evelyn didn't flinch. "I survived this world before you," she said quietly. "You just convinced me to forget that." The words landed harder than she expected. Richard opened his mouth, then stopped. There was nothing left he could say without drawing attention, and attention now belonged to people who were calculating consequences. Jonathan returned to Evelyn's side then, his presence shifting the balance instantly. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Richard took a step back. The room no longer belonged to him. The luxury party continued around them, but something essential had broken. The illusion of control. The belief that silence could be forced forever. Richard glanced once more at Evelyn, his expression cold, wounded, calculating. "This isn't over," he said. Evelyn nodded. "No," she agreed. "Now it's real." As he turned away, his shoulders rigid, she felt an unexpected calm settle over her. Whatever came next, lawyers, fallout, consequences, would be faced in the open. He had tried to corner her in private. She had dragged the truth into the light. And that was the one place Richard Hale had never learned how to survive. The consequences did not explode the way Evelyn once imagined they might. They unfolded. The morning after the gala, Manhattan woke up as it always did. Traffic humming, screens lighting up, coffee lines forming. But inside a glass tower on Park Avenue, Richard Hale's world began to contract. Evelyn wasn't there. She sat instead in a quiet conference room 2 blocks away, sunlight slanting across a long table, her hands wrapped around a paper cup she hadn't touched. Jonathan stood near the window, phone pressed to his ear, listening more than speaking. Across town, the board convened without ceremony. No grand accusations. No raised voices. Just documents placed carefully on the table. Timelines reviewed. Language compared. Conflicts noted. The kind of meeting that ended careers not with anger, but with certainty. By noon, Richard's executive access was suspended pending review. "Standard procedure," the message said. Standard. The words stripped the drama from it, leaving only reality. Evelyn received the update from Jonathan, not from Richard. She read it once, then set her phone down. Her body reacted before her mind did, a deep exhale she hadn't realized she was holding. This wasn't victory. It was gravity finally working. Later that afternoon, legal counsel reached out. Carefully worded, respectful. They asked for clarification on documents Evelyn had been listed on years earlier. Documents Richard assumed she didn't understand anymore. She understood them perfectly. Madison's name surfaced again, this time not whispered, but flagged. Her consultancy was frozen pending audit. Her social media went dark within hours. By evening, she was no longer responding to calls. By nightfall, the narrative had shifted. Not publicly, not yet. But inside the rooms that mattered, Richard Hale was no longer spoken about with certainty. His name now came with qualifiers, with pauses, with phrases like pending outcome and under review. Evelyn returned to the penthouse once that day, briefly, to collect what she needed. The space felt unfamiliar, like a staged home after the owners had already left. Richard wasn't there. His assistant had cleared the calendar. His silence echoed louder than any argument. She packed slowly, deliberately. No confrontation came, no dramatic apology, no rage-filled call. Richard understood the rules of this world too well to beg where witnesses might exist. Instead, he sent a single message that evening. "We need to talk." Evelyn read it and didn't reply, because this was the part he had never planned for. The part where consequences arrived without asking his permission. That night, Evelyn stayed in a small, quiet apartment Jonathan had arranged temporarily. Nothing luxurious, just clean lines, warm light, and silence that felt earned instead of imposed. She slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The fallout continued without her participation. Reviews expanded, questions multiplied. Richard's allies grew cautious. The protection he believed was automatic revealed its conditions. Power, she realized, didn't vanish. It recalculated. And for the first time since this began, Evelyn wasn't reacting to his moves. She was watching the system do exactly what it was designed to do, once the truth was no longer hidden. The party had ended. What followed was not chaos. It was accountability. What surprised Evelyn most wasn't how much she lost. It was how much she gained once the noise stopped. The days after the fallout moved quietly. No headlines, no public statements, just careful emails, scheduled calls, and lawyers speaking in measured tones. Evelyn stayed out of it as much as possible, not out of fear, but because she finally could. For the first time in years, nothing demanded her silence. She moved into a modest apartment overlooking a tree-lined street near Central Park. The furniture was simple. The air felt lighter. Sunlight reached places it never had in the penthouse. On the first morning there, she made coffee in a chipped mug and drank it by the window, watching people walk dogs, jog, argue softly, live. No one knew who she was. The relief was unexpected and profound. Jonathan checked in daily, never intrusive, never hovering. He updated her when necessary, shielded her when not. The legal process moved forward with momentum that didn't require her constant presence. The documents she had once feared now worked in her favor. Her financial access was restored, properly this time, in her own name, clean and indisputable. More importantly, her credibility returned. Emails arrived from people who had gone quiet weeks earlier. Not apologies, acknowledgments, invitations to talk, to collaborate, to listen. The world didn't rush back all at once, but it reopened doors that had been quietly closed. One afternoon, Evelyn sat in a small bookstore cafe, a Kindle resting beside her coffee, when she realized she wasn't bracing for the next blow. Her shoulders were relaxed. Her thoughts moved freely. She wasn't rehearsing conversations in her head or calculating how to appear acceptable. She was just present. That night, Jonathan invited her to dinner. Not to discuss strategy, not to review documents, just dinner. They chose a quiet place near the park, nothing flashy, nothing performative. Conversation flowed easily about books, travel, mistakes they were glad they'd learned from the hard way. At one point, Jonathan paused, studying her with gentle seriousness. "You know," he said, "you didn't just survive this." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "No? You outgrew it." The words settled in slowly. She thought about the woman she had been at the beginning of this, careful, apologetic, trained to disappear. That woman felt distant now, not erased, but integrated. A chapter, not a definition. Richard's name came up only once that evening, briefly. A passing update. He had stepped down temporarily. His circle had thinned. Consequences, it turned out, were lonely. Evelyn felt no triumph, no bitterness, just distance. As she walked home later, the city humming softly around her, she understood something essential. The reward wasn't money or safety or even justice. It was choice. The ability to wake up and decide who she would be without asking permission. The freedom to love again, not out of fear of loss, but from a place of wholeness. Whatever came next, whether it was partnership, marriage, or simply peace, it would be something she chose. And that made all the difference. The ending didn't come with a headline. It came quietly, the way real endings do when life has already moved on. 6 months after the night at the plaza, Evelyn stood in Central Park beneath early autumn trees, the air crisp and honest. No cameras, no speeches. Just a small gathering of people who knew her, not as a wife, not as a liability, not as a headline, but as herself. She wore a simple ivory dress. No designer labels, no statement jewelry. Her hair was loose, moving gently in the breeze. When she smiled, it reached her eyes without effort. Jonathan stood a few steps away, watching her with a calm that came from certainty, not possession. He had never rushed her, never framed love as rescue or reward. He waited until she chose him freely, when she no longer needed protection, only partnership. That choice made everything different. The ceremony was brief, honest, words spoken without performance, promises made without fear. When Evelyn said her vows, her voice didn't tremble. She spoke about respect, about truth, about standing side by side without shrinking. When Jonathan took her hand, it wasn't to guide or shield her. It was to walk with her. Somewhere across the city, Richard Hale signed documents that no longer bore Evelyn's name. He had settled quietly, stepped away permanently. The investigation concluded with findings that followed him into every boardroom he tried to re-enter. Invitations slowed, then stopped. No dramatic downfall, just consequences. Madison resurfaced briefly in a lifestyle article months later, framed as moving on. Her consultancy never recovered. In rooms that mattered, memory was long. Trust was not. Evelyn didn't follow any of it closely. She was busy building a life that didn't revolve around damage control. She returned to work on her terms, advising selectively, choosing projects that aligned with her values instead of her fear. Her name carried weight again, earned, not borrowed. When people spoke to her now, they listened, not because of who she married, but because of who she was. That evening, after the small celebration ended, Evelyn and Jonathan walked through the park alone. The city lights flickered on beyond the trees, distant and gentle. "You okay?" Jonathan asked softly. Evelyn smiled. "Better than okay." She thought back to the woman who once stood in a luxury ballroom erased in plain sight. The woman who believed silence was survival. That version of herself felt like a lifetime ago. She hadn't been saved. She had chosen to stand. And because of that, everything she gained felt earned. Love that didn't cost her voice. Stability that didn't require obedience. A future that didn't depend on someone else's permission. As they reached the edge of the park, Evelyn paused, looking out at the city that had once swallowed her whole. It looked different now. Not smaller, just honest. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she had to prove she belonged. She already did. So, the story has come to an end. And if you're still here with me right now, that tells me something important. It means something in this journey touched your heart, even if you can't fully name it yet. Maybe it was Evelyn's silence. Maybe it was the moment she chose herself. Or maybe it was the quiet reminder that strength doesn't always look loud or dramatic. As the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." This story wasn't really about luxury parties or billionaires. It was about learning that your worth does not disappear just because someone refuses to see it. Life will test us with unfairness, with people who try to erase us, with moments where fear almost wins. But like the Stoics believed, we don't control what happens to us. We control how we respond. Healing begins the moment we stop begging for permission to exist and start choosing ourselves, calmly and firmly. If this story resonated with you, if it mirrored something you've lived through or are still healing from, you're not alone. Take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue these conversations together. Thank you for staying until the end, truly.